2017. Right, here we're looking at the last years of the Zuma era, where I think that everybody, including members of his own party, simply became despondent and had enough. Which means, therefore, the point that I'm saying here is that any alternative at the time would be desirable. Right? Obviously, in hindsight, we all we run things, but if one sort of puts ourselves in that position at that time, any alternative would have been, yes, please give it to us. That was the nature of the place where we're at. Which means, therefore, that from the point of view of Ramaphosa, you've already won before you've announced your candidacy. And that, before he even announced, people said, he's the next in line. Right? You don't have to fight so hard for your primary. If one looks at the EMS, the IMF diagnostic, for example, all of them pointed to problems, stalled structural reforms. Right? This country for about 25 years has had unemployment that hovers between 25 and 30%. Despite the fact that there are periods of growth between, say, 2000 and, say, 2005, it made no dent at all. And that's a structural problem, right? 2, SOEs, completely inefficient. Eskom was as a whole that just begged more money, more bailouts, more money, more bailouts. And you take more from the fiscus and you chuck it in there and it goes into a black hole. That's a problem. Right. Sovereign ratings affects your cost of borrowing. And obviously, the weaker your rating, the more expensive borrowing is. And that government, before this, borrowed heavily. Right? Fourthly, simply increased domestic political uncertainty. I mean, this was the era we sort of tend to forget this point where, court case after court case was a matter to do with politics. Whether it was a branch taking his party to court, whether it's himself, the then president, in court, all the way to a Supreme Court, who knew who was what? Right, and obviously variables that to a large extent were beyond our control, weaker commodity prices, and the most important one of all, drought conditions. And drought conditions take time. You feel them in later years. And in the Eastern Cape today, the drought hasn't gone away, right? And so as a first take is that we're looking at a climate that just simply was uncertain. And the most important one here is that basically the fiscal situation was bad. I mean, there was a point where for about 20 years, where the Treasury would always go on about how do you narrow the fiscal deficit. At that point, with 4 different finance ministers in about a year, who cared anymore about it? Right? And the forecast about the government's total gross loan debt was to rise by 60% by this financial year. Wasn't a pretty situation. Right. And with this, obviously, was the general ineffectiveness of government expenditure. The Zondo Commission, for example, now has a lot of this in light, in the sense that irregular government expenditure reached about 45 billion in the 2016-2017 fiscal year. And most importantly, between 2006 and 2012, South Africa was ranked 54 out of 163 countries in the Transparency International Corruption Index. In 2012, it was ranked 69th out of 176 countries. And so I think that from a broader economic point of view, right, the primary obviously was shaped by this. And a context or an environment, if you like, that simply was not sustainable. And something had to give. Which means, once again, the table is laid out for an alternative. You come into power with one foot in already. Right? And we're going to get to at the end about what that means for Ramaphosa today. Right? But the first thing is that what it means is that, even just to say that I want to be in office, already you've got 50% followers, because it's anybody but Zuma during this period. And obviously, what compounded this is that you had this very unusual situation for South African politics, where the Treasury has always been the kind of department that's been a pillar, right? Where the person who controls the purse string is seen as the kind of stable, safe hands, right? And convention was debunked during this period, which obviously introduces that element of risk. It's not that it is unusual to have a turnover at the level of the cabinet, but for this country, given its experience in 20 years, it was unusual. And that creates risk, because you say, well then, what is going on? Is this a departure from previous? If it is, how so? And I think that what added fuel to the fire here was the repeated downgrades. Right? The downgrades obviously closely and gradually having negative future implications for borrowing. And whenever you need to undergo structural reform, right, borrowing is in your portfolio of policy instruments, especially if you are a developing country. And if the costs of it are going to increase, it has a huge bearing on planning, on money, etc. And so, from the economic point of view, I think that the first question is that it favored any challenge to Mr. Zuma. That's the first thing. You don't have to fight for it. Right. The second variable is that you also had very interesting electoral trends. Right? And this will obviously go back to when we look at where we are today. Because the one thing that we've seen as a whole is that voter turnout usually has an enormous significant impact on the result. And the dynamic you have here is that voters for the governing party who are unhappy tend not to switch. They tend to simply withdraw or withhold their vote. Right? But the consequence of this has been that at the point of 2017, 2 years ago, is that the result is that you've had declining electoral levels of support for the governing party. The peak of which was the 2016 local election, where the governing party, even though it was able to come back later, but at that point, it was able to lose significant clout in important metros. Obviously, the question that the DA has to ask itself is that how did it let that moment slip? But it did. Right? However, at this point, is that one had an increase in the level of multi-party competition. I mean, there was a point even where, I remember, I think it was Malema, where he said he'd rather work with the DA than the ANC. I mean, extraordinary stuff during this time. I mean, we tend to sort of forget this moment where you had some kind of implicit, informal alliance between the EFF and the DA, right? But this was 2016, 2017. We're in a whole new world today. But this was the environment during that time. Right. And the third thing to think about then was that in terms of the ANC, is that you had two competing groups in the ANC during this moment. Right? One, we can call them for argument's sake the nationalists, was led by Mr. Zuma, and the other, call them the reformers, by Mr. Ramaphosa. Right? And even though, like, with these two factions, many journalists tend to sort of look at them as these kind of mutually exclusive groupings. In my observation, there's a lot more overlap between them than there are divisions. And so media-wise and Twitter-wise, they appear to be enemies. But trust me, these people all come from the same stable at the end of the day. They are literally allies in one period, opponents in another, and then allies in a different period. Right? And so therefore, we have to also at the same time rethink how we look at factions in a party. They are less rigid as they're made out to be. They are more fluid, more like an amoeba, if you like, right? And the way to think about them is to think about them in terms of electoral cycles. In that, in the run-up to any electoral cycle, you'll have groupings that emerge. Once the result is done, those groups reconfigure into different formations. And they're based on a variety of things: interest, personalities, people who hang out together, people who have business deals together, etc. And so what that means, therefore, that in as much as this was the natural order of things during this time, those groupings have now reconfigured. Simple as that. And we'll talk about next how they have reconfigured and what we should make, or what sense we should make from them, right? But essentially, during this time, you had basically two competing groups. And in terms of their arguments, meaning what did they say in terms of press releases to journalists, to media, is that one group called themselves CR17, that is Ramaphosa 17, who tended to be closer to businessmen, right? And if one looks at the funders of Mr. Ramaphosa, the bulk of them were wealthy Johannesburg businessmen, basically, right? Which wasn't so much a case of people where he had to seek out funds, but remember that he was in business for many, many years. And these are all his mates who are saying we want to help the brother out, basically, right? By contrast, you had another group that said that they wanted what they term radical economic transformation, whatever that meant for them, right? But the point is that that was the distinguishing feature they had in opposition to the other group. And at the time, we had predicted three possible scenarios. The first scenario was that we said, well then, if the then Zuma people won, right? And I think that I said this to you guys, this is the part that's the recap from the last time I met you guys. We said, if the Zuma people won, right, ANC would split, would fall apart, right? And that you would have a new coalitions that would come out of it. And this was based on observable trends we've seen over previous elections. So if one takes, for instance, say, elections since 2009, right? And here we're looking at both, say, a general election and party primaries, is that most elections have been followed by people either leaving a party, forming a new one, or somehow causing nonsense and a mess But either way, COPE EFF were the direct result of the consequences of a primary. And we predicted that we'd see the same thing if one group wins. Right? So we said that based on the anatomy of the ANC primary in 2000, when was Polokwane again? 2007, and the primary in 2012, we could predict that actually if one slate wins, right, the other will jump ship. That was the first prediction. The second one, we said, well then, the same thing would happen if the other slate wins. Right? And the thing is that the one thing about slates winning is that you're able to fashion your regime with a freer hand than you would if you have a compromise. And this was the result. And I must admit, I remember we were in this lecture theatre, we said that I did not expect a compromise. And it happened. You had unity. And unity is where the first problems begin. And so unity, where you had a package. So if one even looks at the way in which not only the top six in the party was formulated, but the NEC, you've got a gentleman from one group and one from another one below. One group below, etc. It's like they sat somewhere and drew up a list and said, we're going to make sure that this is the list that's going to come out, and that will be the result of the primary. Right. And the thing about unity is that it made sense for the ANC at that moment. It made sense to say, if the trend is that losers of conferences leave, or they, what's the word? They, you rather have you in the tent paying out than aren't paying in, then rather have all of us in the same camp. Right. And so therefore, the electoral performance would have been dependent on the balance of power within that compromise, which was not clear at this moment. Because one at the time wasn't sure where the link between Ramaphosa and Mabuza was. Because Mabuza at that point was neither a Zuma person nor a Ramaphosa person. He's his own man, which is another kind of cat amongst the pigeons at the moment. Right? And the same thing is that while we know that Mantashe is a Ramaphosa man, one isn't sure where Mashatile is at. And so you've got this collection of individuals who represent different interests in the party and have to somehow agree. And so our prediction here was that, firstly, is that the party would hold together, but you would have ongoing policy incoherence. Right? That you would have a large cabinet, meaning whatever Tito Mboweni thought around reducing the size of the cabinet to what, 17 people, when you have unity, that's impossible. Because all those 6 people want their own people in the cabinet. Right. And so therefore, under these conditions, we predicted that the ANC would drop to about 56%. We weren't that far off the mark. But however, we flopped and assumed the DA would grow. It doesn't. This is the big question. What happened? We got this right, we got this horribly wrong. That's the first question, I think, going forward. And we also predicted that the EFF would double support, and it didn't. So there's something about what voters want that's simply not resonating with what the parties are offering. I think that's what we can draw maybe tentatively now, is that there's a mismatch here between voter interests and what is out there in the market of politics. And that we therefore predicted that actually the end game could be that things would continue just to muddle along. And we're right. Things are just muddling along. Right. And so if we are to therefore begin with Ramaphosa being elected as party leader, I think that there are sort of three main things to take out of it. Right? And I think that with most leaders, always quite you have to sort of go back to when you got in the party, what did you say, firstly? And you fast forward to, well, then where are you at today? Right? Is it the same message? Or do you flip-flop given whatever audience you are talking to? On the one hand, do you say, we want to reform this, but then to these people you say, don't do that? And Ramaphosa said three things. Firstly, is that his campaign was on what is called a New Deal, right? And in fairness to him, he did have 2023 as his deadline. And so I think that in 2 years' time, or 3 years' time, we can actually say, well, then, given that you said this in 2017, where are we in terms of that? Right? Good yardstick to measure. And the second thing he said is that he wanted to transition towards what is termed a manufacturer-led approach, right? And we'll see in February how far we are when he delivers Sona in that regard, right? But I think that in terms of what to take out of his first 100 days before the general election, we can argue that, firstly, and I think that he hasn't changed so much for this, that the number one is that he is a presidency of summits and compacts, right? And I'm not sure that he is as a hands-on and doer as we want. And so the emphasis is on consultation, deliberation, and more consultation, and more deliberation, right? Secondly, is that it's clear that there is an emerging grouping within his inner circle that comprises of Mandashe, firstly, who is his old ally, Pravin Gordhan, too, who was the coordinator of his primary, and Tito Mboweni, 3. And I'm not quite sure what the nature of this relationship is. But what's emerging is that this is turning out to be a significant player in the policy circles of the cabinet. And I think that given his position inside the party, I would say maybe tentatively is that it's a person to watch for the future when we're thinking around succession, right? Not that he will win, but that as a variable in that. And the third thing to come out of it is that a lot of what he's been doing is trying to use the resignation of ministers to reshuffle the cabinet by merging departments. Right? And obviously the argument there is that by doing so, you're able to disable networks, firstly, right? That is the old networks. And two, is that the end result is to reform SOEs. Now, what the reforming of SOEs means is not clear. I think that on the one hand, and maybe we can talk about it later, the third thing to do is that, it could mean this idea of how do you unbundle SOEs. Unbundling means that, they could look like SAA, because SAA already is unbundled, right? You've got the different arms that, that work differently. But the point is that this isn't clear at the moment. Now, going into the general election, I think that there were sort of 4 points of risk that we identified. And the first one was the continuing social protest, right? And this relates to the relationship between the state and its own people, which on the best part of it is non-existent when it comes to poor people, is not there. Right? Basic things, delivering of services, the mere fact that ghettos exist as they do today means that there is a breakdown in that relationship somewhere. Right? And one isn't clear at what point is that breakdown, because elections happen every 5 years and people vote. Right? And so there's a point where it is renewed, but somebody clearly gives, which is ordinary people, and someone doesn't give back, which is the state. Right? The second one was labor. Right? What are the implications of unemployment? And what to do with existing unemployment that's in unions? Not clear around that. And I think that what, as Field of Fire, is that it's still unclear how we are going to resolve unemployment in real terms. Third point was issue around land. This was the time when every newspaper, every talk show talked about land reform. And one wasn't clear what this land reform will mean. What does Section 25 mean if you want to amend it? Right. And obviously, given this, our question was, how would this affect the election result in 2019? Right. And I think that here we had what is called 5 main scenarios that we predicted. And our worst case scenario would be that literally nothing happens. Right? And that firstly, you could have, yes, the removal of Mr. Zuma, for example. But then you could have a case where the party loses its outright majority, but retains power through a fragile election. And we said that if the ANC loses under those conditions, right, then you would have a case where growth would be limited or stuck below 1%, where things would not really change, but would remain the same and will descend into the glut that we're in 2016. That was our first prediction. What we termed the worst case scenario. And so here, the argument here, I think that this was that an ANC loss in the election would come with consequences. Right. The second here, and obviously this was done obviously with us having rosy eyes for the president in mind you, right? The second one was that we said, well then, the ANC might win the election, right? However, it could be a case where you have early gains with SOEs. And here, obviously, we're talking about ESCOM here, though. But that you would have limited project. As in, like, the president's hands would still be tied. The implications being that we are in a better place, but still in the same glut. Right. Things change, but they don't remain the same. We predicted a baseline. This was my prediction, a baseline, in which ANC would improve performance based on a fresh candidate, right? Even though that candidate is hampered by a unity vote. But we assume that actually, no, it might actually, work out well. But one where one would able to have limited reforms or limited progress, meaning we're at a better place from the glut that we're in. And then the better case scenarios was if, for instance, you had a case where the president had a free hand, and the argument here is that the freer the hand he would have, the more ability you would have to do the kind of reforms that you want. Right? And the argument here would be that, well, then, therefore, we'd assume that the freer the hand you have, the more you're able to get the kind of result of the reforms you want. Our, firstly, upside, and two, our best case scenario. That is, all the things you say are possible happen. Right? And obviously, for the things that you're saying to happen, you need to have a good hand, a good increase in support for your own party, to show support for your ideas and what you want. Right? This was us on the eve of the 2019 election. The next question, therefore, is what happened? And what do we read from all of this? Right? And I'm going to rejig your memories a bit, because it's important for us to appreciate where we're at by first looking at what these results mean. Right? And the first thing is that what happened was a gray area. It was the murky world of politics, in which nobody got what they want. Not the party, neither the opposition got what they want. Neither the citizens got what they want. We're always somewhere in the middle. And the first thing to consider in this regard, that I think perhaps is more important than what people think it is this matter of turnout. And that if you look at the level of turnout, and this is the turnout of people who are registered to vote. It's not turnout measured as people who are eligible to vote. Very important distinction. And so we're looking at the amount of people who are on the books and who choose to vote. And this, in my opinion, as that measure of turnout is in fact quite low, I think. And this is a trend that we have seen in previous elections, in that there's gradually, or both voters firstly, and secondly, the population is getting less much of a healthy appetite for seeing elections as a means of shifting things. The appetite ain't there anymore. I mean, if one looks at it in terms of, say, things like, if we look at it in terms of numbers, we can say there are about now, give or take, 28 million people on the voters' roll. Right? Of those voters, 10 million vote ANC. 10 million of 28 million on the books. And then about another 5 million or so vote DA. And so there's a massive, massive gap of people who just don't show up. And so therefore the result, I think, nobody gets what they want, is a reflection of that. And it's interesting. I mean, the first thing here is that ANC goes beyond 60%. But it breaks that margin. And this is a function of turnout. This trend should be seen in light of their performance in the local elections, where their members have said, you know what, we're tired now. The news is about this group fighting against that group because they want to tender from this guy who's friends with that fellow. It's all about the palace here. Right, the fight over the palace, over who should know. I didn't get the carrot cake, I wanted the chocolate cake. Therefore, I'm now your enemy. Right, and journalists feel this. I mean, like, Man and Guardian, feel this stuff. Business, feel this stuff. Right, doesn't resonate with what people want. Right, but for me, what's interesting for me is not so much this, though, but that deficit. Look at that. That's a massive deficit. There's no, I don't get how they're going to get there in light of that. In that the parties of opposition also performed poorly. DA loses about 1% and chucks out their leader. I mean, it's fine if you chuck the fellow out, if you lost a town or city, but you lose 1%, you throw him out. That has huge implications for the ability of this organization to even get to Damascus. If you're not getting there, if you're going to chuck your leader out for party loses 1%, no, right? Which has huge implications for this lot here. In that, given this dynamic, I don't see these patterns or these trends changing in the near foreseeable future. I don't see it. I mean, obviously, we had predicted, in fact, that given that they were a lot more cohesive and that you would see some growth, right? But the result simply confirms that, these leaders, like these ones, are out of touch with their base. Thirdly, EFF, once again, we predicted, and I think that that's partly the fault of us, because we assume that we can look at our politics, especially around all these issues of, populist leaders, etc., in the same lenses as trends in parliamentary systems elsewhere, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Latin America, etc. But the trend here has not or the bug hasn't caught on here at all. And that what we thought would have defined this electoral cycle today, debates around land reform, it's out the window. That's not the priority here. Land reform was only important, it seems, insofar for electoral purposes, which once again calls into question their credibility. Once again, the base, out of touch with people. And what's interesting here is that the amount of response for land reform was interesting. People actually wanted to talk about it. They get into office and lo and behold, it's about ESCOM, SOEs, Pravin Gordhan. It's all gone to the shelf, and maybe in the next election you'll dust it off a little bit and we'll all relive that whole thing, right? And once again, we therefore have this trend where all the other remaining parties, right, have a small share of the vote. And this is now what, 25 years, 26 years after 94. And we've had the same pattern. And there were moments when we thought that would break the pattern, but we haven't. And so I think that what we can look at this, our result for now, going forward, is that firstly, it is a compromise on the downside. This is where we are today, right? In that large governing party that once again won by a landslide, right, is held together, but those people who are Zuma loyalists, once again, factions change. They now are reconfigured elsewhere. I think that the way to think about it is this: if we compare how we look at factions in, say, a dictatorship to a democracy, in a dictatorship, factions last forever. I mean, there are points where it's a case where this person's dad died because of me, because of you, and then it's 20 years later the beef is still there. In this case, factions are not rigid; they're fluid, and so it means therefore that during the 2017-2018 period, I may have been a strong Zuma supporter, right? I may have been this person who would have, literally broken my back to make sure that this person is able to get whatever outcome he wants of a scenario. After this election, I'm now a pro-Ramaphosa supporter. I can give an example. Pravin Gordhan, for example, right, was in the Zuma group. He was for many, many years. Right. In the same way as Mr. Zuma was in the Mbeki group for many years. And so I think that it's sort of good to sort of think of groupings, factions, etc., more as interests in a certain time, as opposed to these permanent fixtures that remain batting for that camp. Because Mr. Zuma now is no longer a variable at all. He's not. His power's lost. It's all done. The next thing now is about how new power centers will configure is the next thing. And this, I think, is where all of these battles that we see today, the battles over ESCOM, for instance, are simply means or simply the kind of terrain, if you like, for the formation of new groupings. Or whether it's, thinking about SOEs in general, for example, become the kind of battleground for new formations. And so you might have had, for instance, a person like Tito Mboweni, who was in the margins for many, many years. Now, all of a sudden, he's thrust into the limelight in ways that other ministers were not and are not, which gives one a sense of authority where when it comes to these new groupings being formed, you either are more likely to align to one group or another, or to form your own group, obviously in the context of these party battles. But I think that where we are now is that we're in a sort of case where people did not expect that. Right. We all expected the continuation of some form of competitive multipartyism, whether it's from the DA or the EFF or whoever it is. But that hasn't happened. And so therefore, if it not happening, we're going to expect what? More of the same. That's what to expect. Yes, with more competition, I'll build now, sorry. Yes, with more, if we have more competition, then you expect, all of these terrains to have significant battle sites. This is the case now anymore. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you. Yes. In terms of what? In terms of SOEs? I think that for me, the one thing about Ramaphosa is that, and maybe I didn't mention it now, but in this what's it, PowerPoint, is that the one thing that I've taken note of the first kind of, because it hasn't been 1 year yet, but the first sort of 6 months or so, was that when the public protector published the Bosasa, whatever, the CR17, that revealed the people who funded Ramaphosa's campaign, one thing that I took note for me though, was that there is no current politician in the country that can compete with that. Meaning nobody can raise that amount of money for a primary. No one can do that. And I think that if those people, and here we're looking at not like some small fry in some northern place, but we're looking at real power brokers, where you raise an obscene amount of money for primary. Chances are you probably double that for your general election, and no one can do that. And so, in terms of the position of the president, to answer your question, is that I don't foresee any significant challenges now, because I don't think that at this moment there are people or groupings who can raise that kind of money and win. And so the dynamic, for the moment at least, is that people will more likely side with him and use him as a vehicle to pursue their ambitions, as opposed to the other way around. And this, I think, is important if one thinks of, say, Mabuza, for example, right? Or Mashatile, who I think are maybe the two people at the moment who probably will not make an early challenge per se, but are potential people for succession. I don't think that they would have the kind of resources to muster against Ramaphosa, now at least. I mean, obviously things can change in a year or 2 years, but for now, I don't see it. And so I think that what that does, I think, is that it gives the president a kind of sense of time, in that you don't have to rush things. Mr. Zuma, for example, by this time would have reshuffled his cabinet, right? And doing so had to do with the fact that you're not secure in your base. You're not. So if you're not secure, you have to constantly move you around a little bit. And for him, he spent his whole tenure, I think, insecure. On that note, though, no president in this country after 94 has served 2 full terms. Not one. And so I think that, so I think that it's not so much about security, it's security when. And Ramaphosa, I think it's security now, and you can see it. If you compare to Mbeki, for example, I don't think that Mr. Mbeki was as secure in his first year, in the party at least, as Ramaphosa is now. But Ramaphosa is secure for different reasons. He just has more money than everybody else. And so, and that can go a long way when it comes to important sites of power, like a conference, for example, or when you have to campaign for a primary or an election, for example. In the meantime, people may critique you, right? And they may, say things against you, but when it comes to an NGC, or when it comes to a national conference where you have to actually campaign and mobilize, that's where money becomes a huge variable. And so for me, I would say that he is secure for now for that only reason. That's how I read it. Yes.
Why did David Mabuza change his line and support Ramaphosa?
I think that David Mabuza, if one looks at his background, right, and his past, and where he his career up to when he became the premier of Mpumalanga, is that Mabuza was always his own man. That's the first thing, right? And so yes, he had mentors. I think his main one was Matthews Posa. And yes, he had different mentors, but it was always his own man. That's the first thing. The second thing is that if you look at membership trends in the ANC over time, right, you'll realize that Mpumalanga has always had a gradually growing membership, where initially it began as being this province that was comparable to, say, not Free State per se, but like Limpopo, for example, where it was always KZN, the Eastern Cape, and Gauteng that had the most members, right? But during the time when Mabuza became chair of the party there, membership grew to the point where I think that he got into a position where he could become a kingmaker. And so therefore, he was never really committed to either side, which meant that he would always shift depending on where he perceived the winner will be. And so therefore, you go for the winner, not for because Ramaphosa is your friend. So if, for instance, had he perceived that the other side would have won, he would have gone there. I think that journalists obviously sort of portrayed the image of the Premier League as this kind of cohesive group of premiers close to Mr. Zuma. But in fact, if one looks at it from an empirical point of view, even Magashule is his own man, right? I mean, yes, his I wouldn't say his error per se, but he did throw in his lot with the Zuma crowd, but he became SG nonetheless. He got what he wants. And so for me, I wouldn't see them as Zuma players. I would see them as players in their own right. And the same with Dlamini Zuma. I think that people, journalists, incorrectly simply assume that she's his ex-wife, whereas in fact she's a player for so many years. She's a player in her own right, and that it suited people on the other side for her to be portrayed simply as his ex-wife for the purposes of the primary. And I mean, I would even go further and say that this whole Premier League thing even was probably a figment of the other grouping as a way to lump them all into one and to portray them as, if you don't vote for me, given the climate we're in, and you vote for them, we'll still be in the rut. I think that was the narrative, I think. Yeah. Okay, I think we can open things up for questions and debates. I think that we've, yes.
Through all this, I have not heard a word about what role corruption plays in all these machinations, factions and stuff like that. And it seems,
Yeah.
if I'm reading the right paper, corruption still goes on.
I think corruption can happen in. I think one way to approach corruption, I think, at this level, I think, is like this: to say, when a party is in power for a long time, right? And by a long time, I mean since the formal end of apartheid, there has been no turnover in terms of who's had the majority in parliament. The implication is that the governing party begins to depend more on the state as an employer, number one, right? And obviously by employer, I sort of don't just mean that your senior members of your party, that is, become whatever directors general or chief directors, but even at the level of provincial and local governments, right, where you employ people in a small town on the basis of which party affiliation they're in. And what that means is that the distinction between party and state blur, right? And where that becomes important is when things like when you have to procure services. So, for example, when I have to give you a contract to build a road or to build a bridge, the dynamics of that contract are within the confines of the party, right? And so it becomes not normal, that's the wrong word to say, but becomes a way of doing business with the government through the party. Which means that for as long as, I think at least, you have this deficit, right? You can have as many commissions of inquiry as you want. You can have court cases. You can have endless amount of inquiries and exposés, but you won't resolve that structural problem. And so it sort of becomes less about this activity that we do behind the scenes in the dark, smoke-filled rooms at 3 a.m, but it becomes a very open way of which we conduct government business. That's what happens to it. And so yes, I think that as a consequence of power and too much power, yes, the system in general has been corrupted. And I think that there's enough evidence to go around. I mean, you sort of don't have to go into ledgers and look at things. It's really